All right, I'm getting the thumbs up. That means we can get started. So this is being recorded. And for those of you at home, live stream, except perhaps if you are in the Central Tower. So there might be a few of you in the room might have had a little challenging weekend. I understand that there are a few issues that we had. First of all, I just want to start off by addressing these so that we can just kind of take those off the table before we begin. I understand that the East Tower was without hot water this weekend. Unfortunate. I understand that there was a valve that failed that required them to turn off all of the water, drain the whole system, fix the valve, and then turn the water back on. I am told that it is now fixed and the water should be heating. So by the time you go back, you should have hot water. Unfortunate. And then Comcast is the other issue. So you might remember last spring, we were going to add Root Sports to our cable network so that folks could watch the Mariners. We signed a contract with Comcast back in May. It took them to October to even schedule it, and then they were out here last week. Part of that project means they have to update the cabling, all of the infrastructure in the towers in order to get you all the new upgraded package. While they were doing some of the infrastructure work, something happened. I don't know exactly what. Something got knocked loose, whatever. It hasn't switched over to the new system yet, but we understand that there were some challenges with the signal, both in the East and the Central Tower. I'm told that the East Tower is now back to normal. The Central Tower, there's an Xfinity truck out front right now. Our staff were talking to them this afternoon and got them to come out. So hopefully they'll be able to trace that down. Whether this afternoon or tomorrow, I'm not sure, but it is definitely in the works. So apologize for that. Just to go back to the new system, the new infrastructure, once the cabling is in place, then they need to go around to everybody's apartment and update your cable box. So it's not going to be an instantaneous switch and on and off. It's going to take them to come to your apartment and get you your new box and then set you up with the new system. So each of you can look forward to that, those of you who have cable. Okay. I wanted just to talk about that first so we didn't have that lingering in the room with us as we go into this next part. All right. So today, I want to start by just talking a little bit about net operating margin, what that is, why it's important. Go into the process of how we go about building a budget. Talk a little bit about the lost revenue that we are incurring from the West Wing apartments being taken offline. Talk a little bit about the competitor rate comparison. We do have some intel from our competitors to just kind of see where our rate increase aligns. And then talk a little bit about the capital budget for next year as well. All right, so what do we mean by the net operating margin? Well, you probably could guess. This is the difference between our revenue and expenses. It's what's left over at the end of the month, at the end of the year. This is how we measure our financial health, essentially, right? This is how we're measuring our financial health. And I want to just point out, we are a nonprofit organization, 501c3. Nonprofit is a tax strategy. The IRS says, you guys don't need to pay any income tax because you're a nonprofit organization. But it is not a business strategy. There is no organization on this earth that can operate without making a margin, without making a profit. It is required in order to have a healthy financial organization, which Horizon House is. There's your calculation. So we talk about margin, and it can be interpreted as a dollar amount, revenue less expenses, or it can be talked about as a percentage, revenue less expenses divided by your revenue, which gives you the percentage of profit as your profit as a percentage of your revenue. Okay, so we talk about margin. It can be interpreted as either the dollar amount or the percentage. We talk about it in terms of percentage margin. So, NOM, net operating margin, why is it important? Our net operating margin allows Horizon House to fulfill its mission. That is basic of our margin. It has allowed Horizon House to expand over the last 6 decades, and it also allows us to maintain beautiful spaces, amenity spaces within the campus. It also, and I think this is very important too, allows Horizon House to retain a single site status. You may not be aware, but in the senior living industry, there is talk, and lots of it, of affiliation. And if you are a for-profit organization, this would be called mergers and acquisitions. As you can imagine, we feel like an affiliation would not be good for the Horizon House culture. When the board went through its strategic planning process back in 2020, one of the things they said was that Horizon House culture was of the utmost importance, and that was the one thing that their job was to preserve no matter which direction the board decided to move the organization into the future. They rejected the idea of an affiliation at that time. So there are many multi-site life plan communities across the nation that would love to have Horizon House as a member because we are strong financially. Now, if we were a weak financial organization, they might also like us to be a member. It benefits them by having a wider base, and it would help us if we needed that financial help. But we don't. We are not a financially distressed organization. We know that Horizon House is special. We've had, if those of you who were here when Sarah McVeigh was here, she would refer to it as the special sauce, right? Horizon House culture is a special sauce. And I would add to that it's not just the resident culture that's the special sauce here. The employee culture is also very unique, and it's the interaction between the resident culture and the employee culture that makes Horizon House that much more special. And we want to maintain that special sauce within the organization. There are advantages of affiliating with an organization, as you might imagine. For an organization such as us, it might mean we could have some reduced costs. For example, you have many locations across the state or whichever, and at each one of those locations, you would not need to have your own CEO. You would not need to have your own CFO. You would have one corporate office with those costs in it, so therefore your operating costs might be lower, but does that come with a price? You might also not have access, maybe not access, you would not necessarily have input into decisions, right? The corporate office would make decisions, they'd be pushed down to the community, and you wouldn't necessarily get your input heard by the leadership of that organization. So I think we feel that an affiliation is not necessarily something that Horizon House would be willing to move to anytime soon. We want to preserve the Horizon House culture. Retaining the culture comes with a cost, and that cost is a margin, but it also helps Horizon House to last indefinitely into the future. No margin, no mission. I'm not very good at advancing my slides, I'm sorry. So the accumulation of our net operating margin over time is what really allows us to fulfill our mission. Any one year worth of margin is great, but it's really the accumulation that we've had over the last 60 plus years that gives us the really strong balance sheet that we have today. And it preserves our culture. All right, so this graph shows us the margin over time. I talked about it in dollars and I talked about it in percentages. So the blue bars are the dollars and the red line is the percentage. So we've had ups and downs over time here over the last 23 years. And you can see our margin budgeted for this year is 4.8%. Typically, we don't like to see below 5%, although we've been at lower than 5%. But this year, the board approved a margin of 4.8%. And if you're wondering what that rate increase is, I'm just going to get it off the table because you probably all came to hear that. The rate increase this year is 6.5%. And I'm going to show you why that is. Each year with this margin, Some of it gets spent depending on what's happening in the vision of the board and where they want to invest those resources. Sometimes it just gets put in the cash account. It's invested. And it gets put in our investment account along with all of our entrance fees, maybe not all of them, but depending on what's going on, some of the entrance fees. And then we have a cash reserve that builds up over time along with the earnings on that investment account. And so we have a nice reserve, partly because we've had margin over many years. All right, so before I get into the details of the budget, I want to talk about the process. It really does start with looking at our expenses. We do not start with, well, what are we going to charge the residents this year, and then how are we going to spend that money? We look at what does it take to run the operations of Horizon House, all of the staff that it takes, and how do we provide the highest level of service and value for all of you. That's how we approach our budget process. Labor is the largest cost in our budget. It's over 2/3 of our expenses go to labor. That's wages, benefits, and taxes. We ask our department heads every year to submit their labor budget. And then we look at that and we evaluate that compared to where we're operating today. And we say, is that higher than what we're operating with today? Why is that so? Is it lower than what we're operating with today? Why is that so? And we work with our with each of our managers to really understand how much labor they think it takes to run their department. Basically, we do the same thing with our non-labor expenses. They submit their their non-labor budgets for supplies, food costs, maintenance contracts, anything that it takes to operate this building, the operations here. And again, we look at it compared to what did we spend so far this year? How does that compare? What did we look at last year? How does that compare? And again, we evaluate, is it higher? Why is it so? Is it lower? What did we miss, right? We don't want to miss anything either. So I will say, on the labor side, there are no new positions built into this budget. Some years we do have new positions. In the past, we've added 24/7 security, right? So those are some new positions that we added. 2025 budget has no new positions, so that means those positions are either filled today with our staff or they're actively being recruited for. So nothing new coming on the horizon in that sense. So once expenses are completed, we have a good idea of what our expenses need to be. We then look at applying various rate increases to the revenue base to see what margin that results in. Finance Committee then evaluates not just one rate increase, but a variety, a range, to kind of evaluate what does that look like in the bottom line as well as that margin. After the Finance Committee looks at that, they make a recommendation to the board. Then the board and the Finance Committee meet together. They talk about it, they review it, they again look at the ranges. Gives the board some opportunity to ask questions. And we don't ask the board to vote on it at that meeting. We wait for another week so they have that opportunity to have more open dialogue, should they wish. And then last Tuesday was the board meeting, and then they did approve the budget with a 6.5% rate increase. This meeting today is occurring because one of our wise resident Finance Committee members suggested that we work with the resident council leadership as the best way to communicate this with residents. So when we met with the leadership of the resident council, they suggested that we hold a special budget meeting. So that is why we are holding a special budget meeting today with all of you. All right. So again, monthly fee increase for both assisted living and independent living, 6.5%, which results in a net operating margin of 4.6%. This includes independent living occupancy at 98%. As we remove West Wing apartments from our inventory, available inventory, our occupancy is going to increase. So it's going to be 98% for next year. Assisted living occupancy is 73%, so a little bit lower, but it's higher than we are operating at today. Wages and benefits. You can see a big number there, 13.5% for wages and benefits. This question has been asked. It was asked at the small group sessions. Is the monthly fee used to pay for the West Tower? Well, to the extent that your monthly fee includes a margin, as we just talked about, 4.8% for this, 4.6% for 2025, your monthly fee pays for that. But that is no different than any other year that you've lived here. Every year there's a margin. This year it just happens to be going towards paying for the West Tower sales and marketing costs. But 5 years ago, it was going for something else. That margin is always in there. It's always baked into your monthly fee. So is your monthly fee used to pay for the West Tower? Only to the extent that there is a margin built into your monthly service fee. You might ask, well, how are we paying for the West Tower right now, right? We're in this pre-construction period. We've got Anderson and Methuen doing a lot of work. How are we paying for that? As I mentioned earlier, we have a cash reserve. That's the accumulation of our margin, of our entrance fees over time. That's been put into a cash account, has grown and earned interest and earnings in the investment account, and we're now using that to invest in Horizon House's future. That is what we're using to pay for the West Tower. Let's talk a little bit about the budget challenges. So labor is one. You saw that. 13.5% increase over annualized numbers from 2024. Pretty good increase. The other challenge, of course, is the lost revenue from removing the West Wing apartments. So let's dive into the labor part first. This is a chart that shows the average wage increase for employees. That's the red line. The bars at the bottom are the monthly service fee increases over time. Seattle moved to a $15 minimum wage in 2021. And you can see that from 19 to 21, we had to increase wages significantly to get to that $15 minimum wage. You'll also notice peaks and valleys in that red line. And that is because we have a 3-year union contract. So the first year, we have a big increase. The following 2 years, much smaller increases. And so you get that up and down in that growth line. So you can see significant wage growth increases where we did not increase monthly service fees above that 3 to 4%, which was very typical when we had really low inflation and we hadn't had a pandemic and wage growth was roughly 3% every year. That changed significantly. 10% in 2021 alone. And we charged 3.5% monthly service fee increase. So we are behind. So when you say why 6%, why 6.5% now? It's because we didn't do it earlier. And we didn't have to, and let me show you why. So the blue bars here is our total payroll costs, wages, benefits, taxes, right off of our financial statements, audited financial statements. And you can see from 17 to 20, they're pretty flat, even though we were making our way up to $15 minimum wage. And why was that? The red line shows the number of full-time equivalent employees. If every employee worked full-time, that would be the number of FTEs we had. We were declining in our FTE count. That's why our wages were flat, even though our wage earnings per employee were going up significantly. In 22, we bottomed out. In 23, that's when we had an 8% monthly service fee increase. 24, 7.5%. And now this year, we're doing a 6.5%, and you can see the wage increases are really high. That is because we had our union contract. This is the peak of the 3-year cycle. Union contract was ratified this summer. So we're at the peak, and the next 2 years will be a little bit lower, but this is really why we didn't have to charge you higher monthly fee increases while we were building up to the higher minimum wages. All right, so the removal of West Wing apartments. So this has also been impactful. We're trying not to put this on the backs of you, right? We promised that this would not be something that you guys would have to pay for. It's getting harder and harder to do that. I will admit that. Lost revenue from West Wing apartment rentals this year, monthly fees, is going to be about $1 million. Next year, it's going to be closer to $2 million, and that's going to continue until we get the West Tower opened. I will also let you know that lost entrance fees from West Wing relocations. Today, total $8.6 million. That's a lot of cash that we do not have in our pocket. And that's impacting the master planning, the timing of the master planning, not necessarily the plans themselves. It's just the timing because we don't have the cash right now to fund it. We will get back there once we get these relocations done, which we hope to at least have the apartments selected by mid next year. And then we can get back to that normal entrance fee turnover, which will allow us to do more of the master planning work that we had projected. So when the West Tower plans were announced back in 2022, there was strong resident feedback that we were not to move residents off-site. We heard you loud and clear. At the time, Mike Ostrom was here. He and I, we looked at that. We evaluated it. We looked at the financial impact. We looked at, the culture impact that that would have on the community if we did that. And we made a decision to keep folks here on site as residents requested. That was very important. I will tell you, if we were affiliated with a large organization, there is no way they would have made that decision. It would have been way too expensive, and it would have all been about the money. That's not who we are. That's not what we do. We did this because we felt that that would have a big impact on the culture. You all felt that that would have a big impact on your culture as well. And so we honored that, and here we are, and we will be able to accomplish that. I think we have about a dozen households left who have not yet selected a new apartment. So we are on track to get that done by mid next year. Not everybody moved, but at least the apartments selected. So that will be happening. I also want to point out in our expenses for this year's budget, it does not include any additional costs that we may incur as we decommission the West Wing. Relocation of the Monday Market, relocation of parking, all of these things that we're still working on, don't have answers for all of them. What we're still working on, that's going to cost us some money. That is not included in any of these numbers, okay? That'll be over and above. It'll be paid for by the margin. All right. So we are thinking about ways to offset the lost revenue from the West Wing. One way would be to maximize assisted living occupancy. As I mentioned, 73% is what's budgeted. I think we were at 74% last month, but if you've seen the memorial board, we've lost several residents, and so we're sliding back down. So we're really looking at ways to be able to maximize assisted living by looking at external folks who might be able to help us and prop up the occupancy level there. We're also looking at, we will also be charging higher fees for new incoming residents. Now, this is a strategy that Horizon House has used many times over the years, so it's not new, and it's really a result of our actuarial study that says you're not charging your incoming residents enough. We try to keep our fees low, so if we charge them the same that we charge you, we fall behind over time. So we have to every now and then boost those monthly fees. We have to boost those entrance fees. And so incoming residents will end up paying more than what all of you are paying today. And then lastly, we're looking at ways to occupy our vacant West Wing apartments while they're still here. Short-term rentals of some kind. We're trying to figure out the best way to find an audience for that particular stay. We would like, maybe a 30-day type stay. We've talked to hospitals, schools. They all have their own brokerage program where they find, housing for their temporary, staff and students. So we haven't really tapped into any resource yet for that sort of short-term stay. If you have any ideas, I'd be happy to hear what you have to say, or any contacts with organizations that have short-term folks visiting. We'd love to have that conversation to see how we might maximize that. But that's another option that we're looking at. Okay, competitor rate increases. Horizon House is the orange line right in the middle. You can see we have been lower than the others in the last couple years, but higher in the last 2 years. And then at the 4-year totals, for those that I did have 4-year totals on, Horizon House is 26.5%, Bayview 28%, so a little bit higher, Skyline a little bit lower. And if we look at what they're doing this year alone, Bayview is at 5.75% for independent living, 6% for assisted living. Skyline is at 4% this year, but they have been higher in past years, and they also have done mid-year increases. So we don't know if that will happen or not this year. Mirabella is not reflected here because I did not have a 4-year history on them, but they are at 6.75%. Again, we are at 6.5%. So all this to show you it's not because we're doing a West Tower project. This is the cost of business in the city of Seattle. Minimum wage requirements. Most of our costs come from labor. This is why we have to charge what we have to charge to get our margin to be able to make sure Horizon House is around for many years to come. Just quickly, and then we will open it up for questions. Capital budget for next year. I will preference this by saying I don't know that there's been a year that we've actually spent the total amount of dollars that we have on our capital budget. So while this is $24.5 million, this year was $36 million, and we've only spent $18 million through the end of the third quarter. So I'm pretty confident we have plenty of wiggle room here for any unexpected capital projects that may need to come up. But for the most part, we've got our master plan, $5.3 million. Some of the detail. This is essentially finishing the assisted living area. So we've got the we've got the serveries completed. So we're going to be finishing that up, but then we'll be moving into the assisted living office space, an activity room, then the second floor offices for the executives to move up there. That's what's planned for 2025, so that in 2026 we can move into that bistro dining room project. Early works is some items that need to be completed so we can actually tear down the west wing. These are some utilities that are in that building that need to be relocated so we can make sure that they're still functioning when we tear down the building. There's some egress issues about when we close down the west wing hallway. How do we get in and out of the building? And so there's some things here that we have to do before we actually are able to demolish the west tower or west wing. So that's about $3.8 million that we'll have to spend. Routine CapEx, $8 million. Most of that, half of that, comes from apartment renovations. That's just the cost of us doing business here. We also have some sustainability efforts in there, elevator upgrades, and then we are in the process right now of upgrading our nurse call system, and that will continue into next year as well. And then the West Tower is $7.2 million of that, again, coming out of our reserves in order to pay that. So you will be getting your rate letters in your mailbox, in your cubbies, I should say, before Thanksgiving. That's our goal. Sandy's hard at work getting those out now. The rates, of course, will go into effect January 1. And now we are able to open up for questions. We'll bring the microphones around so you can.
Will the executive offices stay up on those floors? They'll be permanent?
Yes, the idea is that the executive offices moves up to the second floor. That will be their permanent location. Yes.
So it's a one-time?
Yes.
remodel.
Yeah.
Now, when will the increase in entrance fees for new residents kick in and be established?
We increased our entrance fee pricing as August 1st, went up significantly. So 13% overall last year, we increased our entrance fees.
Okay, and that would be likely to be reestablished on an annual basis then?
Yes, we're not going to raise them again in 2025, but again, we will raise them again in 26.
Okay.
Question in Fireside Lounge.
Yeah, I just want to clarify the 6.5% increase. Oh, the 6.5 increase is our monthly fee increase. Is that correct for 25?
Yes, 6.5% rate increase for all monthly service fees, and assisted living unit fees and care level fees. Some of the other services will be going up a variety of increases. They're not all 6.5%. For example, choice dining, I think actually is 6.5%. It's going up from $300 per person to $320 per person. Parking, I think, is a little bit less, maybe closer to 5%. So some of the services, not necessarily 6.5%, but definitely monthly service fees and the assisted living unit and care level.
Will you explain what the capital expenses are for the West Tower? I assume it's not actual construction. Is that right? What is included in that?
Sure. So most of the cost of the West Tower can be capitalized. Of course, that's an accounting thing. So it is the cost of Methuen and their design fees. It is the cost of Anderson overseeing Methuen and, of course, making sure their design is something they can actually build. So all of that pre-construction cost is what's included in that capital number.
Have you borrowed any money for the West Tower as of today?
No, we have not borrowed any money for the West Tower. I will say that we have borrowed some money for the master planning efforts.
Hello, I'm new here and I didn't understand what the Reno apartment is all about.
Apartment renovations, that's what that stands for. It's the renovation costs, yes. Where are we? Charlene's coming.
What's the parking garage cost going to be?
If memory serves me correct, Jim, it's 190 today and it will be 200, I think, is what it will be for next year. Don't quote me on that. I'm something around there. Anybody remember what your monthly parking is right now? It's 190 today, so yeah, it's 200.
So when you add them all together, it's more than 6.5% because you add food costs, parking costs, et cetera.
Those are all, I believe, those three items are all going up 6.5%.
I was going to ask, if I can remember what I was going to ask. I'm right.
Oh, sorry. I heard the voice. I couldn't see you.
You've established a schedule of costs for the apartments in the West Tower. Will that remain stable until people start moving in, or will it be increased annually?
So you're talking about the West Tower entrance fees, that the pricing that is set today?
No, well, I actually did want to separate the two. There's the entrance fee, but then there's the annual cost. And I think really the annual cost is what I'm more interested in.
So we haven't published the actual monthly fees for the West Tower. What we've published is what we believe the rate would be in this year, 2024, applying the same rate increase that we would apply for all of you and sort of carry that forward into 2029 when those apartments would be available. So we don't necessarily have a published rate for the 2029 monthly service fee. And the other part of that is the entrance fees most likely will continue to rise as we get closer to construction and even closer to opening. That's just the way things work in marketing and sales. Yep, sorry.
A couple of questions. One is, are we far enough into this to know if the parking rate at the new West Tower will be similar to the parking rate for the rest of the parking garages, or is there a difference?
Well, the West Tower parking garage will be the replacement for the existing parking. So yes, from my perspective, it'll be the same rate for everybody in that parking garage.
And then my second question is, and maybe this has been told to us before, but is there any plan for borrowing money for the final construction, a short-term, long-term? And what's the threshold before that kicks in?
For the West Tower financing?
For the West Tower, yes.
All right, let me touch on that a little bit. So there are two tranches of financing for the West Tower. One is a short-term financing that gets paid off with the bulk of the entrance fees that we collect. The other tranche is a long-term, 30-year, maybe 35 years, depends on what is best when we go to financing, tranche that will be held similar to a mortgage and be paid down over time. So one will be paid down with the entrance fees once we've collected the bulk of those, and the other will be longer-term mortgage.
My question was also about the financing once you start building. And how is that loan, from what source will that loan be repaid?
It will be repaid from the West Tower monthly service fees and entrance fees when they begin to turn over.
So it's entirely from the West Tower, is the
Correct.
plan?
The financing model for the West Tower has to work for the West Tower as a standalone building, right? So that's what we're measuring, that's what we look at. It has to work as a standalone project. Okay, folks. Oh, one more.
At the very beginning, or at least when I came in, you were talking about the cash reserve as a really important part of our financial picture. And then later on, you talked about spending the cash reserve. That seemed like the contradiction.
Sure.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. Part of our bond covenants, so right now we hold tax-exempt bonds, and part of our covenants and the measurement of our financial health is how many days cash we have on hand. So while we are spending some of that money, and I will say I think we've spent maybe $8 million of it, but it was $70 million when we started. So we still have a significant number of days cash on hand. It's over 700 days. And if you look at our industry, particularly for a single site, that's probably in the 75th percentile of all single sites. So we're still doing very well on cash on hand. And that's something that we monitor very closely, and we will never let it go down to a point where we're at risk. Oh, let's go to Ina first, and then we'll come back to you, Luis.
So, is there any point, once you get into the construction phase, once money is going to be flowing out, is there any point where it is possible that you would dip into the endowment, let's say, or any other cash reserves that or investments that you have here, so that we would be affected by it?
So the West Tower financial model shows 100% borrowing of all of those dollars for that West Tower project. So we would be borrowing both the short-term tranche and the long-term tranche, paying off part of that within, the opening of the West Tower, then carrying the rest. So there's no modeling of using our investment accounts for the West Tower. Again, that model has to work on its own. It's got to stand by itself without the endowment account, without the investment account. We can't look at that as a source of financing for it. It needs to work by itself. Luis.
Are your slides going to be on HH Connect?
They sure can be. Such a cheery afternoon, yes? Hi, Jim. Yes.
The cost of living has gone down across the U.S., but our rates have not.
The cost of living hasn't gone down. The rate of inflation has gone down. I know Social Security's only 2.5% this year.
Yeah.
So yes, definitely something that the Finance Committee considered. The board looked at that as well. Understand that your income may not be going up this particular year the same amount. But as you saw, our expenses, if we go back, the difference between what we're paying our employees and what we've been charging our residents doesn't fill that gap that you're seeing from 18 over to 2022, right? Those percentages are much larger than the difference between your 2.5% that your increase is going to go up and the 6.5%. It is a delayed increase. And you know, if we had the consistent full-time employees across all time periods, your rate in 2021 would have probably been closer to 8% rather than 3.5%.
My income doesn't go up to meet the new requirements.
Yep. Yep, I understand that some of you are concerned about your monthly fee increase and the impact that that will have on your finances. Horizon House has a safety net. That is one of the reasons that some of you may have chosen to move here. We do have the Resident Assistance Fund that will help support you should you run out of your financial resources. That is something that past residents have taken very seriously, put concerted effort in to be able to make sure that that is something that can support anybody who might need it. That residents contribute to, says Doris, yes.
Christy, regarding the West Tower financing, there must be significant uncertainties about costs at this point, since who knows what the supply.
Well, there's
chain
always
is.
risk, right? So it's really a measurement of benefit versus risk. There's risk to us not doing a West Tower.
Right. So
right?
what is the process for monitoring that and sort of figuring out if there's any alterations that are needed?
Sure. Let me start with the cost of the West Tower. So as we go, so we've had various cost estimates over the last 2 years, depending on where we were in the design phase. And we've plugged that into the financial model. Let me just say that, we have support from Sawgrass. They are a development advisor, so it's just not me plugging numbers into a spreadsheet. They are very experienced at this. Those cost estimates have been updated over time. We find that the financial model still works. We will be getting our next cost update in the spring. I want to say maybe April. The board, the finance committee and the board will evaluate it again at that point in time. As we get closer to financing towards the end of 25, there'll be another cost update that will be plugged into the financial model, and the board and the finance committee will evaluate it again to say, is this still working? So there's various checkpoints throughout the whole process, and there's already been probably 3-4 different pricing exercises done, and we still feel confident that we are within reach of doing this project.
Question from Fireside Lounge.
Yes.
Do you have a slide that shows the change in full-time employees over time?
That would be the orange line on this slide, is our full-time equivalents compared to total payroll costs and when we had to meet that $15 minimum wage. Does that help? Thank you.
This may be outside the scope, so just ignore it if it is. But I wondered if there was anything that could be learned from the template of building the North Tower. Are there any lessons that could be applied to our situation now?
There probably are some. I think one of the challenges that we have is that the people and the players are different, right? So that was almost 20 years ago, or more than 20 years ago, when those conversations were first starting. And so having the same players in the seat who learned those lessons are not around necessarily to share them today. We do know, from experience and from, the end result, sort of, how to go about it in a different way in terms of the type of vendor, type of consultant that we needed to build it, right? So we now have development advisors. At that time, we had sort of a full service development advisor who kind of took over everything. We're doing it a little bit more thoughtfully now because we have different partners for different areas that we need support in. It's just not one vendor filling the whole role of everything.
I would also add one thing that's a little different. Back when that building opened in 2007, it was 100 units. So, another, it's like double the amount of units. So that is one thing that can be a challenge. The other thing is competition. We didn't have Murano, Mirabella, Skyline at that time. So again, the kind of attention to it and making sure that we're doing things that are really good for Horizon House, that kind of connected space that we did for the North Tower. These are things we have to really lean into because we do have more competitors than we did back then.
Doris.
As I recall, you had to have a certain number of people signing up for the West Tower with payments, as I recall, by a certain date before final decisions to go ahead. What is the status of that situation?
So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, in order to get our tax-exempt bond financing, we need to pre-sell roughly, the goal is 70% of those units, which would be 142 units. We're at 67 units today. I think that's roughly 32%, and we need to get to 70% by October of next year. So just under a year. So we'll probably be close to 50% at the end of this year, and then we'll 50% of the 142, and then we'll get the other part next year. Couple more. There you go.
As we often see, and I suspect it's more public projects, that by the time the final costs come in, they're considerably higher than any of the estimates. I don't think that happens as much with private development, but what is the contingency for the construction cost that you're carrying right now? And that's apt to change, I realize, but is there a contingency built into the construction cost?
There are all kinds of contingencies built into this financial model. We want to start off very conservative, and so as things happen and maybe we chip away at those contingencies, we still have sufficient contingencies. I'm going to say off the top of my head, it's a minimum of 15% of the cost is in the contingencies, and it's spread throughout various, the Anderson's cost, our owner's cost, various places throughout the financial model.
When we first came here, the cost of living increase was 3%. Last year, the cost of living increase was 7%.
7.5, yep.
7.5, and I believe now it's 8.
It was 8 in 23, 7.5 in 24. It'll be 6.5 this 25.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What was the increase that caused all of these increases?
Inflation and minimum wage in Seattle. City of Seattle, $15 minimum wage occurred in 2021.
Well, I measure the inflation that we get by the increase in our Social Security, and it's never been more than 3%. What happens to the difference in the money? The other thing is that a lot of the expenses that we had have been increased. We don't have a nurse anymore. We there are various reductions in costs, and yet our expenses are higher.
Yes, I agree. I can explain it as it's inflation. We're in a very high cost area of the country. If you look at other parts of the country, we are probably at the top. We just have a very expensive operating location here in the city of Seattle. $15 minimum wage, now it's over $20. Minimum wage is over $20 for 2025. It's very expensive, and we have a lot of staff who are on the lower end of that pay scale. In fact, I would say probably 2/3 of our staff. So it's very impactful when that minimum wage moves up, in addition to having all the inflation on food and all of those other things. Inflation is not fun for anybody, for you or for us.
So I have a question about the level of commitment for people who are reserving places in the West Tower. When you say they make a commitment, how much of a commitment
Sure.
do they make?
Yeah, great question. We are asking that they put down 10% of the entrance fee. That would be 10% of a non-refundable entrance fee. We are offering refundable entrance fees for the West Tower, but we're asking them to put down a 10%. So the minimum entrance fee in the West Tower is about $550,000 and on up. So at least 50,000 or more. It's pretty significant. If they pull out without some life event that causes them to not be able to live independently anymore, they would lose $10,000. So that is the risk for anybody who's put down a deposit.
So you said a refundable entrance fee. Did you do that in the North Tower?
Yeah, so refundable entrance fees are a way of financing. They help us finance, as I mentioned, we have a short-term tranche and a long-term tranche. It helps us raise cash up front, but as you point out on the North Tower, yes, we did sell refundable contracts on the North Tower, and now we're seeing a higher level of refunds come due. The tower is now 17 years old. So it's a mixed bag. We are selling them for financing, but we have no control over when those refunds are due, so we would prefer not to sell a high number of them.
Did you stop it for a while in
We
the North
did.
Tower?
We stopped selling, the Finance Committee had decided to stop selling refundable contracts back in 2015.
Yeah.
So we haven't sold them for a very long time, almost 10 years now. And in fact, we only have, I think, 25 refundable contracts left in the entire building. So as we pay down that liability, that frees us up to be able to borrow a higher borrowing capacity. Are we done? Uh-oh, one more.
This is not on the merits, but I think, in case you missed it, this was a presentation by Christy before being grilled by a bunch of well-informed, articulate people like us. Can you imagine what weekend she had when she's going to know she's going to be here Tuesday morning, and over the weekend the water goes out and the television goes out? Sorry about that, Christy.
If only we could control that. All right, I don't see any more questions. So thank you all. Oh, wait, one more. I see one more over there.
Probably a very naive question, but it's sort of left hanging there. If we don't make the 70%, if we don't sell the 70% of those apartments by the due date, what happens? Do we lose some funding?
Great question, Marcy. So the 70% is a target. If you were to ask any of the potential bond investors for Horizon House, they would say a minimum of 70%. But there will come a point in time where the board will have to make a decision if we do not get to 70% on the timeline that we made. The board will have to decide, is 65% an acceptable rate? And if so, what's the interest rate at that point in time? Or maybe the interest rate's gone up and now we have to wait for the interest rate to come down. That gives us more time to sell. So it's just a matter of all of these things coming together at one time in order for the board to sort of make a real firm commitment to go pull the trigger on financing.
Well, it looks like we need to go out and get the word out what a great place Horizon House is, so that people will be clamoring to come into the West Wing. That is
exactly what we need. Thank you, George. Yes, please. Resident referral is the heart of this community. You probably already all know that. So yes, spread the word. Bring your friends and neighbors, former neighbors. All right. Thank you very much for attending today. I appreciate your time.